Hello everyone, I'm Zach Weiss from Worn & Wound, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Christopher Ward C1 Bel Canto watch. This is something I'm very excited to tell you about, as it is a huge release for the brand, a brand that we have been following on Worn & Wound since the very beginning. It's a huge leap forward for them as a company, and I think just an incredibly exciting watch for anybody who loves horology, particularly on the more accessible side of things. If you find this video useful, entertaining, or interesting, please do like and subscribe. It helps us out. So Christopher Ward is a brand known for many things, one of which is of course being a fairly affordable brand making Swiss-made watches, but something that I like to think of them as is also a brand that is very willing to experiment with complications in a way that really few other brands, particularly at their price point, are willing to do. And it's understandable. Developing complications is expensive. It takes a lot of time. It's not something that a lot of brands really have the capability to do. But since, at least a decade ago, Christopher Ward has been doing a lot of interesting things in those regards. So in 2011, I actually reviewed a watch by them that was a jump hour, which featured an in-house jump hour module that then worked with an ETA 2824. Had I known then the amount of jump hours that I'd be seeing over the next decade, I probably would have put even more of an emphasis behind what a special watch that was, because almost nobody develops jump hours, let alone sells them for around $1,600, which is exactly what Christopher Ward did. There have been several others since then, as well as their own in-house movement. And this is a brand that, once again, sells the watches that are almost always under $3,000, occasionally a little bit more, but even more often just around $1,000. But what I'm talking about today, the C1 Bel Canto is by far their most extravagant watch, their most interesting complication, and something that I think is really, really just super exciting. As you can probably tell just from looking at it right now, this isn't your ordinary Christopher Ward watch. The dial looks nothing like any Christopher Ward dial you've seen before. It features an eccentric hour and minute track, which means it's offset from the center up at 12 and sort of miniaturized. And then there's a whole lot else going on the dial. And what you're seeing there is a dial side sonnerie complication. So in the world of, watchmaking, there's all sorts of complications, calendars, chronographs, etc., but sonneries sort of have a special place in the world because minute repeaters tend to be the most expensive watches that are produced by any brand. There's other kinds of repeaters as well, decimal repeaters, quarter repeaters, things like that. They're few and far between and generally extremely expensive. It's just the nature of making them. So what Christopher Ward did was very clever, and they created a sonnerie complication that brings audibility, if you will, a noise-making mechanism to watches, but they did so at a much more accessible price point. So when you're looking at the dial here, you'll notice that around the edge of the dial is this sort of semicircular shape, and that is in fact a gong. So that is what is going to be hit to make a sound. Then you have a series of bridges and little mechanisms here, some jewels and screws, all finished beautifully, by the way, which are actually the dial side elements of this complication. On the left side, there's a little, sort of V-shaped element, and that's actually the hammer. So what happens is, at the top of the hour, a little cam, which is actually visible through a keyhole cut through the dial here, will flip over, and that'll send that hammer into that gong, and you'll get a pleasant little ding. I think we should listen to it now. So just a pleasant little chime that hits at the top of every hour. Now you might be thinking, in the middle of the night, that's going to be annoying. Well, they have an answer for that. So this pusher that is here at what would be around 4 o'clock is actually an on-off switch for that mechanism. And then that little red hand, which you can see just next to it, is indicating whether or not the complication is essentially on or off. Push the button, and you'll see it moves, the hammer sort of retracts, and it is off. It doesn't say on and off, instead there's sort of a peaceful line and a wavy line indicating sound or silence. So obviously this is a very special and uncommon complication. It's something between an alarm, which I would say would be the most simple and common audible or sonnerie complication, and a minute repeater being the most complicated. This chimes at the top of the hour. It doesn't count anything. It's more of a sort of a poetic complication. I believe they call it a sonnerie au passage, which means, it indicates time passing. There's only one other watch that I know of currently with this complication, which is the Meistersinger Bel Aura, which came out last year. Also an incredibly cool watch, and frankly a very underrated one. But what this did in exposing the complication, also brings in this sort of high-end aesthetic that I think is really another exceptional aspect of this watch. In bringing it dial side, they obviously had to make room for the complication, so part of this module is moving the hour and minute hand up towards 12. You have this sort of smaller sub-dial up there as well, which is just not something you really see very often on inexpensive watches because it requires, quite a bit of work to make happen. You will see this on higher end. You'll see it on, the likes of MB&F, you'll like on Arm & Strom, Breguet, things like that. But, very uncommon, especially at this price point, which, by the way, is around $3,600. Probably should have led with that. But this watch isn't $15,000, isn't $36,000, isn't $100,000. It's $3,600, or at least that is the starting price on a strap. So it's just absolutely, I think, an out-of-this-world sort of value here, and just an incredibly exciting thing for Christopher Ward to do to bring these high-end elements into a much more affordable package. You'll also notice on this dial that there is no logo. So it's actually a really interesting watch for Christopher Ward. The only logo that is present is on the side of the case here on the crown, and then I believe it does say Christopher Ward on the back. While we're talking about the crown, this case is a 41 millimeter titanium case. It also measures 48 millimeters lug to lug and about 13.25 millimeters tall, which obviously isn't thin, but as you can see, this dial has an insane amount of depth going on here because there's a whole complication in there. The module is then built on like a Sellita, SW200 movement, which I believe they probably did to help keep the price down. And that would be maybe my only conceptual criticism of this watch, is that Christopher Ward does make their own in-house movement, the SH21, which is a 5-day chronometer. And while combining this with that might have upped the price a few $1,000s, it still would have been in this fantastically affordable range and just would have made it even more of a Christopher Ward sort of thing. So hopefully they can use this complication again later and we can see it paired with the SH21. I personally would find that just very exciting. A Christopher Ward watch 100% through and through. The caliber with this in-house chiming mechanism is referred to as the FS01, and it is actually based on that jump hour module that I referred to in the beginning. They obviously reworked it heavily, but that is where the mechanics came from. It is a limited edition of 300 pieces, and it comes in this Azzurro blue. And before we go, I would like to point out that this is a prototype, so there actually are some slight aesthetic changes to the final production. Most notably is that at the center of the dial, that cutout there continues all the way up around those gears. So it is sort of closed off here. So that is not what the final will look like. And that's the Christopher Ward C1 Bel Canto. This is incredibly exciting. I think this is like a rare moment in, frankly, watches, period. This might not be something that you ever see again. Who knows if they're going to make it again. I understand that it might be a bit of a radical departure from what they normally make. It might be a little bit jarring perhaps. And it's an aesthetic that, I think simply not everyone might find appealing. I personally find it appealing because I don't have any other watch that looks like this, so that's very interesting. But I think no matter what, you have to give Christopher Ward just the hugest amount of credit for pulling this off and pulling it off at $3,600. Thank you, and please check out the full introduction on wornandwound.com.